Let's turn now then to culture and society and some of the ways in which culture was affecting Christianity, how Christians thought about culture. One of the first places I want to start with is what we might call papal decay. We started the early Middle Ages by talking about the arrival of the papacy. Right? Yes, for centuries it's kind of been building up, but in the Middle Ages you finally have this pope, the papal power that has religious power, has political power. But in the later part of the Middle Ages, there were often extreme levels of immorality even in the papacy. Now, of course, as a Christian who's been shaped by Protestantism, I have a lot of theological problems with the office of the papacy. The current pope, I think, is saying some good things. I disagree with him with some other things, but I think the office of the papacy is not something that is needed or is something that Christ intended. But I think the current pope is a moral man. Right? And so there have been, throughout centuries, people of good moral character. And I think ultimately that's what the Pope was supposed to be. But in the Middle Ages, the papacy kind of becomes a political position for control, and not this religious leadership, the moral example that the Pope is supposed to be. Often there was a lack of really strong control in Rome, and so individuals ascended to the papacy, became pope, sometimes in some very horrible ways. And often the popes attempted to gain more and more power for themselves. There is a series of documents that have been labeled the false decretals that were forged documents that were attempts by the Pope to gain more power for the papacy, that were later determined to be forged documents, right? That they weren't really giving that power.
So they were proving that they weren't actually from the Pope, so they were proving.
No, they like the donation of Constantine, which was supposedly Constantine giving power to the Pope. That's what these documents were. It supposedly gave the Pope power over lands and some other things like that, and it turns out they were forged documents, like the donation of Constantine. During this time, there's also continued tensions between East and West that kind of explode in the Fourth Crusade. Popes were murdered in order for other people to become pope. There were several places during some of those centuries of the later Middle Ages where there were quick successions of popes, right? And so Pope John VIII, for example, reigned as pope from 872 to 882 before he was murdered. And there were 3 popes in the next 9 years. Right? So here's one pope that reigns for 10 years, and then the next 3 popes total 9 years together. Well, as you might expect, the turbulence that would cause in Rome spills out to other places as well. Popes were strangled, they were starved, they were held in prison. Often there were time periods where there were people, where there was more than one person claiming to be pope. There's the rather interesting case of Pope Formosus and what's known as the Cadaveric Council. Formosus was a cardinal and an emissary of the papacy, and eventually he made his way through scheming, through the use of bodyguards and other force to become pope. And there were rumors that his enemies often disappeared. Of course, he died, and after his death, his body was exhumed out of his grave and put on trial. His dead body put on trial in what's known as the Cadaver Council of 897. Pope Formosus' corpse was condemned of all sorts of crimes. They took 3 of his fingers off. One of the symbols for the teaching office of the Pope was this. And so these 3 fingers were broken off of the corpse to suggest that he did not have teaching power. His body was drugged throughout the city of Rome and eventually thrown in the Tiber River.
I'm guessing that didn't give it a death penalty.
No. They didn't try to drown him, they just kind of tossed it in there. But shortly after all this takes place, there's an earthquake in Rome. And people took it as a sign that God was displeased with what has been done. And so this mob rises up against Pope Stephen, who is the Pope in power at that time. There are 6 popes over the next 2 years. And so you can see, especially in that kind of 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, a lot of things going on in the papacy. Between 896 and 904, there were 10 different popes. 7 of them died violent deaths. A good example of the immorality of the papacy at this time is a pope known as John the 12th. He was born Octavian, but became pope at 16 years old. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. Right? Totally above board, him becoming pope at 16. Right? So there's some power struggle going on there. Totally unscrupulous pope. He would hold these drunken orgies. He had a harem of women, so much for clerical celibacy. And enemies or opponents said that he lived the devil's life. His enemies were often found cut to pieces. And so, certainly, Catholicism would say that's not what the Pope should be. And I understand that. That's not representative of Catholicism. But it is a historical fact that this is what happened because the papacy became this political office. And because of that, people would use whatever means they could to gain it or put people in power as the Pope that they could manipulate and control.
What was the 16-year-old name?
Octavian, and his papal name was John the 12th. In the midst of all this corruption, though, I forgot that I had him on the slide. In the midst of all this corruption, though, there were some areas within Catholicism where there were people pushing for reforms. And a lot of that push for reform, wanting to see these changes, both in morality and in some of the hierarchy, were often coming from monasteries. It was the monks who were trying to reform the church. One area of reform was from the monastery at Cluny, France. So Cluniac reforms refer to reforms coming out of the monastery at Cluny. We talked about in the early Middle Ages section about the development of the Benedictine rule and the set of guidelines on how a monastery should be run. Not only what kind of things should be done at different times during the day, how the monks should relate to the outside world, but also the kind of hierarchy that should exist within the monastery. And by the later Middle Ages, we're talking now the 1000s, the 1100s, some of the monks are very concerned that the Benedictine rule had kind of fallen out of use. And so they try to develop a monastery where they can reestablish this rule, or the Benedictine rule. William of Aquitaine, who is a ruler there in France, deeded some land to develop this monastery in Cluny, in order to kind of protect the monastery from outside influence. The land is deeded, right, the ownership is given to Peter and to Paul. And by deeding it, that means nobody could kind of claim it until you bought it from Peter or Paul. So, the idea here is provide a place of protection from outside influences, outside interference for the monks. By the year 1100, there were 1,000 houses in Western Europe, 1,000 monasteries that followed the Cluniac example. And so there was this return to the Benedictine rule spread throughout Western monasticism. Some of these houses that were established as daughter houses, meaning that the leadership was in Cluny. Other monasteries just followed the example of Cluny, but had their own leadership. The plan was that much of your time would be focused on prayer. There was very, very little emphasis given to meditative reading of Scripture. In a lot of monasteries, you spend time reading Scripture and think about it, right? So you're very slowly reading through it. But in Cluny, the emphasis was spend your time in prayer. The Cluniac monks, and also in the associated houses, did very little, if no, manual labor. That was done by servants. Monks were also expected to live lives of silence, and so any communication that was done was used through sign language. As one individual put it, Cluny demonstrated the spectacle of true monks detached, humble, chaste, and obedient, occupied in the continual service of God by means of a highly developed type of liturgical worship. Right? They're kind of totally giving themselves over to God, detaching themselves from society. By the later part of the 12th century, however, there were many monks and church leaders that felt that eventually Cluny and other monasteries had compromised their ideals. And really they felt a lot of these monasteries, even the Cluniac monasteries, ultimately ended up with too much wealth. Because even though these monasteries might be started in places outside of society, eventually people would be attracted to the monastery, maybe not to stay there, but to be near the monks. And so eventually a lot of these monasteries ended up with having villages and towns around them. And that kind of involved the monks more and more in society once again. But especially as capitalism was on the rise in the later Middle Ages, and more urbanization was taking place, even near these monasteries, the monks kind of faced this choice. Do you kind of connect with society, with the temptation of its desire, or do you really try to hold on to that separated lifestyle? And some of those monasteries kind of gave into that connection with life and society, and others said, no, we're going back to that separate lifestyle. And that's where we have the rise of the monastery in Citeaux, France. It was one of these monastic houses that developed to kind of counter the wealth and connections with society like what were happening to the Cluniac monasteries. The Cistercian monks, right, so it's the city of Citeaux, but they're known as Cistercians. It's French, I don't get it. One of the things that they started off with was really rejecting wealth. rejecting luxury. And so there were to be no silver or gold crosses in the monastery, only wood crosses. They focused on a really simplified liturgy, refusing wealth and entanglements with courts, with the fairs that might be around in a city, mills, other aspects of society. Only what was necessary for food, clothing, and rest was allowed. And so you ate as little food as you possibly could, you slept as little as you possibly could, and you didn't have like a very extreme wardrobe of cassocks, right? As a monk, you're not wearing like a different set of clothes every week, but right? Very little clothing. And the Cistercians grew rapidly. And so, these reform movements are happening. And it's not just reform suddenly happens in the 1500s. There are these attempts at reform. Now, certainly there's a difference. A lot of the reform here is moral reform. It's not trying to change the teaching of the Catholic Church. It's not rejecting the Pope. It's not rejecting Catholic tradition or apostolic succession or any of those other kind of things. It's reform of morals, reform of commitment.